Welcome back to the forum. We will now begin our second panel on mitigating non-violent ethnic hostilities in Asia-Pacific. This panel will explore the roles of organizations and communities in mitigating non-violent ethnic hostilities. Governments contribute by introducing legislative frameworks that safeguard minority rights and promote social equality, and by implementing policies that celebrate diversity and emphasize shared citizenship. In addition, grassroots efforts such as inter-ethnic dialogues and community building projects provide platforms for individuals from diverse backgrounds to engage, share experiences, and build understanding. The panel will focus on these various approaches taken to mitigate ethnic hostilities and tensions and to foster inclusivity between communities. On this note, I would now like to invite on stage our first speaker for the second panel, Dr. Taufik Tanasaudi, Senior Lecturer in Asian and Indonesian Studies, School of Humanities, College of Arts, Law and Education at the University of Tasmania. Dr. Taufik, please.
A very difficult session, not in terms of the content, but because we just finished and just have a very sumptuous lunch. So I hope that everybody can bear with me, and I'll try to keep the time for 15 minutes of my talk. So today I'm going to talk about combating racism against Chinese Indonesians. I'm going to provide you with a brief historical context as well as the contemporary dilemmas and the challenges. Because of 15 minutes requirement, I have removed a lot of details in my talks, but I welcome if you have any questions or comments during the discussions. First, it is important for me to lay out briefly the historical context or background before we can dwell into the contemporary issues. Now, in the past, government have played a very important role in terms of, in a negative way, in terms of fostering ethnic stereotyping against the Chinese. Stereotype is, of course, inherent in many communities, and the bad aspect of the stereotype is that it always involves negativities. It has prejudices and biases, and this can easily lead to suspicions, a lack of empathy, reluctance to collaborate, and if unchecked, severe racism. Dutch colonial policy strengthened ethnic and racial boundaries among the racial groups. There were times when the Chinese settlements were confined in a certain quarters or specific areas, and their movement outside the quarters are strictly limited. And the colonial government also endorsed ethnically based institutions, such as school, social organizations, and even sports. These measures create racial polarizations. And that was the colonial time. The post-independent government policies aim at integrating the Chinese citizens, the citizen Chinese, that is the Indonesian citizens that have a Chinese background, as part of its nation-building efforts. It also tried to manage more closely the Chinese community for security reasons and limiting their economic interests to provide more equal access to other groups. And all of these have resulted in measured discriminatory practices against the Chinese. Now, let's move to the third one. Under Suharto New Order government between 1966 to 1998, discrimination against Chinese peaked, relegating the Chinese Indonesian to second-class citizens with fewer legal and political rights. Now, government suspicion toward the Chinese was obviously very overt. It's questioned the Chinese loyalty. It's associating them with communism as well as the failed coup in 1965. And if you look at the historical books before it was recently revised, the ethnic Chinese were portrayed in a negative way in such, like they involve and collaborate with the colonials. They actually harbor any communist links and that type of thing. So it has been framed quite negatively in the historical books. Now, the regime, this new order regime also confiscated Chinese properties without compensations, closed and banned cultural organizations, including schools. So there were no Chinese schools after 1966, with only a few exceptions, and tacitly condemned attacks on the Chinese-owned properties, reinforcing the racial division and justifying the otherings or alienating or marginalization of the Chinese at the grassroots levels. The new order pressured the Chinese to embrace a total assimilation, that is to abandon their ethnic and cultural identities to become true Indonesians. They continue to excel economically though, but they were suppressed and no one actually came to make the condition better for them or come to rescue them. The political parties, 3 at that time, were actually have no rooms to question the government policies. The social organization, the Human Rights Commission, the legal aid institution also face scrutiny. They're also not interested to question the treatment or the discriminatory practices against the Chinese. Now, there are a few exceptions. There are those who actually dare to antagonize the government policy to maintain racial harmony in Indonesia during the New Order, including its discriminatory treatment to the Chinese Indonesians, could be charged under its anti-sectarian policies. Now, let's move forward to the next one. Now, nothing much have changed until May 98. That was when Suharto was forced to step down following a brutal riots and anti-Chinese riots. Encouraged by the newfound political freedom, some Chinese took bold steps to assert their citizenship rights. Within months after the end of the New Order, three Chinese political parties were established. And although they were all short-lived, these political parties have encouraged many Chinese to directly take part in political process, to self-help, to self-advocate, because the past has shown them that no one have come to rescue when they are in trouble. The first few legislative elections after the fall of the New Order also saw significant numbers of Chinese individuals enter the regional and national politics. And simultaneously, Chinese organizations and institutions also proliferated. Nationally recognized associations such as, again, I won't be giving you the details. Nationally recognized associations such as IPS-MHA and INTI, and regional body like MABT in West Kalimantan played crucial roles in coordinating cultural events and helping with policy formulation, particularly during the first few years of the post-New Order years. Now, civil rights organizations formed by the Chinese also took part in an effort to help the government to investigate the May 98 anti-Chinese riots, as well as push the government to address the systemic discriminations. Now, the end result, gradually all discriminatory regulations were lifted, virtually all of them. There were 1 or 2 exceptions at the regional level, but all of the national discriminatory policy and regulation has been lifted or not in practice anymore. Now, even Chinese now, if you ask them whether they have a possibility to become an Indonesian president, the constitution now actually allows Chinese to actually run for a presidentship. In the past, the constitution will not allow that to happen. So that is the series of reform and policy that has been implemented to help the Chinese to get to feel like they're being treated as the equal citizens. But there are a lot of challenges. The first challenges is the grassroots level do not necessarily welcome the achievement or the new environment. Now, while official government racism is a pastime, you also can start to feel that, or can see sometimes the grassroots reaction was quite negative. Now, there are a few reasons behind these reactions. The Chinese Indonesian community has long been stereotyped as economically dominant, but socially aloof and apolitical or non-politics. And this perception has been nurtured for 30 years during the New Order time. These were untrue because as soon as the New Order regime fell and when the opportunity made themselves available, all of those Chinese jumped to the opportunity. And you can see in my next explanation, the Chinese influence actually research in all of the aspects of life in Indonesia. Chinese figures are quite common now, found in the entertainment, news anchor, a lot of media or the TV channel actually owned by the Chinese. And they're also very good or have a good position in the social cultural front, education, health, and even now politics. Organizations promoting Chinese culture also have proliferated. Chinese individuals have attained important political positions at regional and national level at an unprecedented level or scale. Now, this positive development, which will help, ideally, help the Chinese blend into the mainstream Indonesian, increasing acceptance and greater appreciation, unfortunately, has not always been welcomed by the grassroots level, as I just mentioned before. Now, this is the first challenge. Culturally, the sudden revival of the Chinese culture, which has been suppressed before, created fear that local or indigenous culture would be overtaken by the Chinese resurgence. There have been a few tensions in the regions, particularly those with significant Chinese population. Actually, we're very happy to hear that notes about Kelantan from Professor Joseph Leo. Yes, so the tension usually happen in an area where Chinese population was quite significant. Suddenly, for example, the local have to face with the fact that there are new Chinese temples. Now, in the past Chinese temple, during the New Order, you are not allowed to build Chinese temple, a new Chinese temple. You are only able to renovate and keep the existing temple alive or functioning, but you can't build. But after the reform, suddenly there are a lot of new buildings or magnificent big building. Statue also being put down prominently in the center of the temple. And in two occasions, that's being problematized by the locals. For example, not very far from Singapore, I think it's Tanjung Balai, the statue of Buddha were forced to relocate to a less prominent place because the people say that that statue is actually not reflecting the local wisdom, which is, again, predominantly Malay and Muslim. So that is one example. The second example is the Chinese deities, Guan Gong, the warlords. And it was also being problematized by the local people, and then the local authority actually requested that statue, claimed to be the biggest in Southeast Asia, be covered with a white cloth. So those are the two examples. And then I give you another two examples about the Cap Gome. In the past, Cap Gome celebration is a Chinese celebration after the Chinese Lunar New Year, 15 days after the Chinese New Year have passed. And in the past, it was not allowed any open celebrations. But after the fall of New Order, that celebration now being revived. And suddenly, the whole city of Singkawang, this Singkawang city is about 40 to 50% Chinese population. The whole city, for a couple of days, were full with parade similar to Thai Pusam or line dances. While we understand while Singkawang is 40 to 50% Chinese population, area around it is actually majority Malay and Muslim. And that also become a challenge. And also in Pontianak too. Pontianak is the capital city of West Kalimantan. There are also a few other problems with the line dance. So yeah, so that's a few other examples that I mentioned. Now, in Chinese dominant area in Sumatra and West Kalimantan, Chinese political assent has also not been welcome. Under the democratic elections, I can dwell on it later on. Under the democratic election, it is normal to see in Chinese dominant area that more Chinese to be elected into the local legislative assembly. And in the past, such representation is not existent because majority of the seats were occupied by non-Chinese during the New Order. So when the Chinese come and occupy those legislative seats, that means lesser numbers or smaller number of seats is available for the other ethnic groups. And then the discussion in the forum is no longer sterile of the Chinese interests. Because there are more Chinese there in the legislative assembly, then discussion, of course, topics of discussion become more diverse. And that's actually not very welcoming to some. Another challenge involved the growing Islamic conservatism, and this is also already being touched upon by Joseph Leo. One thing that I would like to talk about conservatism is in all aspects, including the religions, increased religious conservatism within society often result in an inward-looking social group whose members tend to distance themselves from outsiders, some to the level of antagonizing and opposing other groups. And this will, of course, lead to social tensions if it's unchecked. Indonesia has witnessed growing conservatism, but governments seem to be very slow or unable to curtail the spread. It, for example, unable to influence the conservative approach of the influential Indonesian Ulema Council, quite similar to the MUIS here. There were a lot of jokes. The current vice president was a former head of MUI in Indonesia, the Ulema Council. And a lot of jokes like the reason why he was chosen as the running vice president when the election was actually taking place was because to appease the radical or conservative elements of the Indonesian community, because now the chairman of the MUI was to become the running candidates. And they were elected. So that is to show you how government occasionally have to bow down to the to the pressures of the conservative pressure. Now, the government also are helpless. The official also helpless to limit the spread of Islamic institutions which preach conservative approach. For example, approach do not select, even in the high school or even in the primary school, when you have to have a class leaders, do not select a fellow student who actually have a different background, different religious background. So this has been quite pervasive in many of the low-level education. And then the government is very hard to stem that spread of conservatism at the education level too. Now, this is all not good news for the plural society. Is the timer running? Timer is already 0. That's already 15 minutes. Okay, look. Look, if that's the case, then I will stop my presentation here, but I will appreciate any other comments to whatever that I've presented to you. I'm very sorry for that. I didn't look at the primer.
Thank you, Dr. Taufik. Now, please welcome our second speaker, Mr. Tan Chin Leong, who is the former Race Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Mr. Tan, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm overwhelmed by the fact that the previous speakers had so many slides. I had one, and I said, no, I don't have time for that, so I dispensed with that. Well, I'm not an academic, so please excuse me. I'm just a practicing lawyer at like they said about lawyers, they love the sound of your own voice. No offense to lawyers in this room, but that's generally probably the way we see ourselves. But very quickly, and I'm going to digress for a while, but I think it's important because it's going to cut into my 2 minutes, but I think it's probably worth the trouble. Mr. Shanmugam spoke this morning of a number of issues, and I would like the opportunity if we could have a meeting in the back room somewhere in Lau Pa Sat, and we can have this fiery discussion about the issues he's talked about, because while we have so much in common, there was some point of differences as well. And you would like to be a fly on the wall to listen to what we have to say about those issues. But those exchanges are terribly important for us to get to the point of understanding this mutual interest. And I think there's so much we can learn from each other as well. But I want to thank Dr. Ben as well for touching on a topic which I spent 5 years doing in Australia. Because there's nothing in my speech about racism, mate. So you've done my job for me. Thank you for that. Giving a perspective about the Australian environment on race issues, because if we're going to tackle racial discrimination, then we must tackle racism as well, because it's part and parcel, albeit not the whole of the spectrum, but an important element of making sure we get cultural diversity right. So very quickly on that one, like Dr. Ben, I also acknowledge the traditional people, the indigenous people of Australia, the land of which I come from in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people. And I can't welcome you because it's not my land, but I do acknowledge them, and I do want to express the word they used in welcoming, and it's called Wominjika. It means, in simple terms, welcome, but it means to come with purpose. So to you all fully acknowledged today for your participation and distinguished guests as well. Each nation arrives at its contemporary culturally diverse state as a product of the forces and dynamics and matrix at play in the course of its development. And I've used the term cultural diversity or culturally diverse as a point of convenience to include all forms of cultural, ethnic, racial, and religious diversity. And my topic today will be very high-end. It's the big picture stuff. So if I missed anything and you want a little bit more details about what we're talking about, I'm happy to have discussions with you after this session or in the Q&A. Many countries are settled with its culturally diverse demographics and must deal with it as it is. As well, countries seek to craft meaning and its national mythologies arising from the reality of its culturally diverse population. Now, to understand the issues and challenges of cultural diversity requires an inquiry and understanding of the particulars of national cultural diversity experiences, particularly at the current point of the respective countries' national aspirations and prerogatives. Countries adopt different approaches, principles, and cultural diversity management models. They may range from approaches such as what has been known as differential exclusion, the term that Stephen Castles from the University of Oxford used to mean accepting migrants only within strict functional and temporal limits such as guest or foreign workers. For example, as a way of controlling cultural differences. Another model that has been used mainly up to the 70s and 80s, but still arguably exists in different guises, is assimilation, an approach whereby immigrants are directed to take on the social and cultural practices of the mainstream society in which they have settled. The multicultural model is familiar to many. It is the model adopted by countries like Canada and Australia. What is Singapore's model? I don't know. It'd be worth discussing that. And I suspect it's a hybrid of different ways of approaching this one issue. So there are, of course, hybrids and variants of the models that I've mentioned, and has not been regarded as inconsistent when forms of these approaches are found to exist side by side in various countries. And many contain objectives that aspire to a homogenizing outcome for its society. Now, approaches and models adopted by a country are not static. They are capable of being abolished or subject to transformation. And it's more than 200 years history. Australia has transformed from a society that was captive to a form of exclusionary, differential exclusion, to full-blown assimilation, the white policy, to its present status as a multicultural society. In my view, multiculturalism is an ideal approach to express and manage cultural diversity. It's not a simple idea or term, and it's not a simple concept to grasp, and it is not without its complications or challenges. Now, even in the countries where it is the operating model, there is likely to be deep reservation, disagreement, and uncertainty about its benefits and about how to interpret or implement it. The idea and practice of multiculturalism involves aspects of tensions and conflicts such as the need to balance social cohesion and unity against the demands and needs of cultural diversity. It is a term that is used variously in different ways in different countries and different contexts. Multiculturalism, in short, is about the idea that every group is entitled to equal rights in society without being expected to relinquish their diversity on the proviso of an expectation of conformity to a certain set of key common and shared values. It is an endorsement of cultural pluralism. Stephen Castles referred to, now this is important because I find this very enlightening because all my time I've been practicing cultural diversity and the field as a policymaker, and it's very, very rare you sit down and think about those issues. And so this forum has given me an important perspective about sitting down and thinking through those issues that you've been running and doing. So it's about the doing that we've been involved in, and not enough that thinking about exactly what it is that we're doing. So Stephen Castles referred to two important foundational elements of multiculturalism. One, a recognition of diversity element which acknowledges the validity and positive contributions of groups' identity, culture, language, and then secondly, a social equality dimension, which focuses on the equalization of opportunities for migrants and minority ethnic groups. The social equality aspect of multiculturalism is concerned with ensuring equal and equitable opportunities and outcomes, representation and participation of minority and ethnic groups. To that end, government-focused and actions are directed to both positive and negative initiatives. The negative initiatives includes the enactment of anti-racism laws, and the positive aspect is focused on supporting communities and recognizing the rights to diversity and equal participation in society. Now, I believe that multiculturalism thrives best when underpinned by democratic values. You would think, well, you're from Australia, aren't you? What I think differently about how you see this, but it is a view that, for me, is fundamental in our understanding of why multiculturalism works in Australia. So for me, that democratic values that we have, and I'm not suggesting for any moment that every country would have the same, but for us, this underpins a lot of the strength of our multiculturalism. Democratic principles and values provide the conducive ground most able to nurture and support the demands and tensions of multiculturalism through open, deliberative, inclusive, and free discourses and conversations. James A. Banks, the professor of diversity studies at the University of Washington, said this, and I quote, "Only when a nation state is unified around a set of democratic values such as justice and equality can it protect the rights of cultural, ethnic, and language groups and enable them to experience cultural democracy and freedom," end of quote. The concept of recognition of diversity and social equality are fundamental factors, in my view, that should be given critical place in the discourse and in the planning on managing cultural diversity by any country or by any society. The effect and measure of focus on these two elements is understandably a matter of the degree and form which such critical attention could be given in the context of the political circumstances and prerogative of a country. The quest for unity in most countries has often been pursued and achieved at the expense of diversity and social equality. Stephen Banks pointed to this undesirable outcome when he said, and I quote, "Unity without diversity results in hegemony and depression." Well, depression too, but it's oppression. Well, it does too. The mental health aspect of racism is very clearly an area of keen interest in democracies like Australia, and I suspect even at the point where we are in Singapore. But he was equally mindful to assert that diversity without unity leads to balkanizations and the fracturing of the nation state. Failure to recognize diversity and to include ethnic and cultural communities into the structure and fabric of the mainstream society, with these cohorts attaining political, social, economic equality, leads to alienation, marginalization, division, resentment, radicalization, and even to ultimate acts of violence against the state and society, a specter that is not in the interest of nation building for any country. While the commitment to multiculturalism involves giving relevant and critical attention to recognizing diversity and social equality, there's always a potential for conflict between the two elements. Clearly, a successful multicultural policy must seek to achieve a correct and proper balance of the two elements. Achieving a desirable balance is a Herculean task for policymakers and practitioners, and may sometimes appear elusive because of the rapidly moving and changing dynamics in the community and the frequent shifts in policy and government priorities. Leadership by the state is important to guide the process and resolve competing claims and emphasis, but active role and leadership by civil society and ethnic community leaders are equally essential and desirable in resolving differences and conflicts. The lexicon for cultural diversity is not complete without social cohesion and unity. Now, I maintain that there's no inherent conflict or contradiction between affirming diversity on the one hand and upholding unity. Balancing cultural diversity with unity, and in the case of Australia, with its democratic values, is the continuing challenge and conundrum for a culturally diverse society. For ethnic communities to trade off a more reflective and considered and clarified cultural identification position to progress the causes of unity requires a reciprocal national commitment to ensuring the integrity of delivering on the required standards of justice and equality. The point is well articulated by Stephen Banks in suggesting that ethnic communities are best able to contribute and foster, and he says, an overarching national identity only to the extent that it mirrors their perspectives, struggles, hopes, and possibilities. Cultural diversity or multiculturalism, if it's to be properly rooted and sustained, must be understood as more than just a policy or political concept. How communities learn to live and thrive together at a point what I call the crucible of difference. That is the point where differences in beliefs and practices may not be capable of being shared and accepted across communities, and that will determine the true strength and resilience of its culturally diverse community. In his book, The Dignity of Difference, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks urged that in an interconnected world, we must learn to feel enlarged, not threatened by differences, and we must take seriously the disciplines and constraints of the dignity of difference. Rabbi Sacks suggested that conversation, a genuine form of respect, of listening, paying attention, and conferring value on the opinions and views of others was an answer. It is a culture of understanding that means giving every other human being every right that you can claim for yourself. Live in a philosophy that establishes a rationale to a way of life based on the practices of recognizing and respecting cultural diversity and toleration. It is generally recognized that cultural diversity adds to the economic, cultural, and social life of a society. It is important to continually highlight and promote the benefits of cultural diversity to the society and not merely regard cultural diversity as a problem to be dealt with. The use of laws, and we heard about this quite a fair bit, to guide, direct, and sanctions conduct and behaviors within the framework of a society's cultural diversity engagement or relations is common in Australia. In cases involving non-violent ethnic hostilities or disputes, the civil law applies, and these matters are substantially dealt with by means of mediation and conciliation. So it begs the questions for me, not so much as an academic or policymaker as it will be for academics, it begs the questions as to the place, desirability, and effectiveness of the law, particularly criminal law, as an instrument in managing cultural diversity. Multicultural principles and practices in Australia are both institutionalized and communalized. By that I mean that they're adopted and practiced at the level which is described as a whole of government and whole of society. It is institutionalized in that every state and territory in Australia has in place a Multicultural Act of various forms with the exception of the federal government, which is pretty ironic, but we're getting there. We'll get there. Which defines its commitment to multiculturalism through frameworks and policies. It is communalized through the process whereby much of the responsibilities and heavy lifting for the implementation of multicultural policies are devolved to the community and led at the community level. There is a general recognition and acceptance that the agency for the implementation of multicultural policies and practices should ideally rest with multicultural communities, as they are the entities intimately and ultimately affected and regarded as having the greater understanding of the issues and solutions, as well as having the necessary grassroots mechanism and network conducive to spreading messages and to delivery of services. Lastly, and I just want to conclude on the basis of some more practical aspects of what we do, particularly in the role that I play within multiculturalism and in race discrimination. So in my work, I have adopted an approach that have oriented my focus on 4 areas. which I'll just go quickly through, and I might have time, I'll expand on that, which I term as constitutional. This is the society's legal and civic framework on cultural diversity. Institutional, how its institutions embrace and practice cultural diversity. The narrative, the public discourses and conversations on cultural diversity, what the media does or doesn't do and how well it does that. These are important aspects of the narratives of the nation on issues of race and race issues. And then the community, its understanding and practices of cultural diversity. And at the implementation level, I've adopted a policy focused on 5 areas of cultural diversity operations that I've called the 5 Ps, which is the alphabetical Ps, namely in the areas of principle, how we state our case, what we do about where we stand, the framework, in areas of policy. How does our policy match up to what we believed in, our principles, the processes that underpins, the lubricants that lubricates the way we do things and believed in what we do, the programming, and of course, the practices. And this approach allows policymakers like myself to develop a holistic overview on the state of cultural diversity and to concentrate resources on the areas that may require particular attention. And I'm coming to my conclusion. The time is run 0. I'm not even looking at it, so I'm okay. There are lessons to be gained from understanding that while issues surrounding cultural diversity and discrimination are matters of particulars that reside in national context, they are also universal in nature. The recognition of diversity and social equality are critical elements that contain the seeds of social cohesion and unity because they provide for a minimal guarantee of protection to citizens of equal rights, fairness, inclusion, and justice, and reinforce a sense of belonging and inclusion. What those minimal standards are will vary from country to country, but there must be a consensus, some agreement of what constitutes adequate and sufficient protection of rights to sustain the respect for diversity and the social justice of all groups. For cultural diversity to be successful, we need to look at cultural diversity development not just through the lens of politics, economics, nationalism, security, safety, or policy concerns, but as a process of human endeavor, individually and collectively, in learning and appreciating how to live together in peace in a world of difference. And lastly, I'll conclude on this basis. We must, in our pursuit of cultural diversity, unity and social cohesion objectives towards nation building, continually remind ourselves that upholding cultural diversity is part of a larger human endeavor to promote justice and equality. And I think we achieve the best and most fruitful outcomes for our societies when we recognize and honor the universal values inherent in the dignity of all human persons with all their inherent identities. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Tan. Our third speaker for the panel, Mr. Christopher Gordon, Secretary of OnePeople.sg, will now give his speech. Mr. Gordon, please.
Thanks very much. A very good afternoon to my fellow panelists and participants at today's IPS-MHA Forum on Nonviolent Ethnic Hostilities. First of all, please allow me to express my appreciation to Matthew and the IPS team for the wonderful effort organizing today's forum. It's very timely. It's my privilege to address you during this second panel discussion on the topic of mitigating nonviolent ethnic hostilities in Asia Pacific, and I'm very honored today to share the stage together with Dr. Taufik Tanasaldi, Mr. Tan Chin Leong, and of course, Dr. Matthews, who I work very closely with at OnePeople.sg. Now, I'm speaking today in my capacity as the secretary and also board member with OnePeople.sg. We are an organization which champions racial harmony initiatives in Singapore. I've been volunteering there now for close to 4 years. And like what Chin Leong mentioned, I'm not an academic by training, so you'll find that today I'll share a little bit more about ground initiatives, anecdotes, stories that we've picked out in the work that we do, community building. Now, I feel it's important to first start off by sharing what I personally believe to be the key tenets of Singapore's philosophy towards race relations. And I can characterize it the following way. First, let me just get the... Oh wait, it somehow went the wrong direction. Sorry, huh? It's supposed to be, sorry, I'm just trying to, oh wait. Okay, is there one more slide? Hold on, because there was supposed to be another slide. Okay, I'll move, I think the slide got replaced. But the first point I wanted to make is, we are realists. We don't presume that social cohesion is the natural order, and there are many issues which are socially divisive and can tear society apart if not handled well, including race and religion. Likewise, we don't believe that we live in a utopia where there are no differences or disagreements between people of different races, religions, and nationalities. Now, we suffered from the ill effects of, okay, so that was the first slide, right? If you get me the other slide, this one. So we suffered from the ill effects of racial violence before, and we are determined for history not to repeat itself. Coming 21st of July will be the 60th anniversary of the most bloody race riots in Singapore's history. 23 people lost their lives and 454 suffered severe injuries. So this is why we often appear to be overprotective of our social cohesion. Since young, all young Singaporeans have the mantra of racial and religious harmony imprinted into our DNA and impressed upon the importance of having clear OB markers and red lines we should not cross. So for example, it is not okay to make insulting remarks about someone just because of their ethnicity, religion, or nationality. As a racial minority in Singapore myself, I'm blessed to be a beneficiary of such a stable state of race relations. I was born here in the 1980s, almost 2 decades after the race riots of '64. As a Eurasian, and there are a few Eurasians here today, like President Sandra of our Eurasian Association, we are someone of mixed Caucasian and Asian ethnicities. And I was often the only racial minority in a class which was majority Chinese. Despite this, I don't recall an incident in school where I felt discriminated against because of my race. Yes, my teachers and classmates would sometimes be curious and ask me about my ethnic background, but I never felt stereotyped or discriminated against. Now, I caveat that these are my own personal experiences, and there could be other Singaporeans out there who may have faced challenges with racism, so I don't presume to be speaking on behalf of everyone. Now, incidentally, my first experiences with racism came during my overseas studies in the UK in the early 2000s. I recall a number of unpleasant incidents which I believe had to do with casual racism, or worse, discrimination. In one instance, I had just finished a late-night movie, and I was cycling back alone to my dormitory when a group of young white men came up to me, and one of them tried to shove me off my bike as I was cycling past. I was fortunate I was quickly able to steady my bike and speed off before there was any further aggression. In another incident, a group of us Singaporean and Malaysian students were at a fast food outlet celebrating the birthday of a friend. In the middle of the dinner, I suddenly felt there was something sticky in my hair, and I realized it was chewing gum stuck to my hair. And I realized that there was a young white man from a neighboring table. He had been aiming the gun towards our table. And I still remember one of the girls in our group was angered by what he had done, and she wanted to confront him. And I told her, just leave it be. If he wants to be immature, just let it be. She was actually very brave, I felt, certainly braver than me. And on a lighter note, you know it's very irritating to get chewing gum in your hair. You can't just wash it off. You almost have to pull your hair out with it. So the chewing gum ban, actually not such a bad idea after all. So I often compare my experiences in the UK and Singapore, and I'm actually very grateful I didn't encounter overtly racist behavior in Singapore, including antisocial and violent behavior. I think it has a lot to do in large part with how we are very mindful when it comes to race relations. We know the red lines. And as Minister Shanmugam, I think, shared in his keynote speech, we have strong policies to promote integration in areas like housing, education, national service, to name a few. I think in some people, they might even criticize the government at times for being too obsessive, intervening in almost every aspect of life. But you cannot refute that these policies have been quite instrumental in helping us achieve the very stable state of race relations we have here today. Right? Now, ultimately, our philosophy and approach in Singapore is that the state of race relations that we have, the stable state, was hard-won. We must always stay united and cohesive and never allow society to be divided along the lines of race, religion, or nationality. This is non-negotiable. So the case for community organizations and ground-up efforts, if government can do everything, why do you need community organizations? Beyond stable race relations, can social cohesion be achieved by government policies and interventions alone? My view, policies, legislation can help to promote a culture of tolerance. Legislation can help to set the overall tone for society, setting out what constitute egregious behavior for which legal action can be taken against an offender. Policy interventions, housing, education, national service, you can create an ecosystem which promotes social mixing. You can minimize segregation in your communities, your workplaces, your schools. But government policies and legislation alone cannot change mindsets and behavior. So in my work in One People SG, I often go to schools to speak to our students about social cohesion. Last year, I was speaking to a group of youth, students in one of the junior colleges. A young boy of Indian ethnicity, he spoke up about how he was racially abused while walking to school. He said that an elderly Chinese man would spit near him every time this young boy walked past. And he experienced this a few times and was quite sure it's not just a coincidence. 60 years on from the race riots of '64, numerous legislation and policies which Min Shanmugam talked about, it's still disappointing to see such behavior still exists. And one of the students asked me, can't the government intervene, compel that elderly man to change his mindset, make him not racist, force him to go for some sort of a mindset conversion workshop? So my reply to the students is, at the end of the day, there's a limit to what government can do with policies and legislation alone, in particular on something as personal as your individual beliefs, your value system. So I flipped the question to the students, and I asked them, is there something that each of us can do in our homes, our communities, our schools, our workplaces, to positively influence those around us? Therein lies the role of community and ground-up organizations. They play a critical role to shape positive mindsets and behavior at the last mile. There are 3 ways that I would like to share with you that community organizations can do so. First, building advocates, ambassadors, change makers, and the idea of turning racial incidents into teachable moments. So I share with you another story. A number of years back, I worked in an engineering and research organization. There was a good mix of Singaporeans and permanent residents. And a number of these citizens and PRs were PRC born in China. I recall one incident when a Singaporean colleague of mine, he made a very casual joke about the PRCs, calling them Ationg's. It's a derogatory term for the PRC-born community. He didn't intend to target the PRC-born colleagues per se. He was actually sharing a private joke with the Singaporean-born colleagues. But the casual joke was said out loud, and I'm quite sure some of the PRC-born colleagues heard it. After the racist joke was made, another colleague pulled the group aside and privately told them, don't you think it was insensitive to make such jokes about PRC-born Chinese? And asked them to empathize, how do you think our PRC-born colleagues would feel when they heard that term? I appreciated what he did and how he did it. First, it took great courage for him to step up and point to the entire group that they were in the wrong, making fun of someone from another nationality. The easier path would maybe to have just let the joke pass and risk upsetting the entire group. Also, I appreciated that he did it in a way which was non-confrontational. Rather than chastising them loudly in front of the whole company, he pulled them privately to convey his point, so he gave that space for them to reflect on their behavior without being thrown into the public spotlight and being put on the defensive. In essence, he turned an incident, what was a negative incident, into a teachable moment. Imagine having tens or hundreds of thousands of such ambassadors, advocates, change makers, creating such teachable moments every day in our homes, our communities, workplaces, and schools. Real and sustained change can take place. That's why in One People, we focus a lot on capacity building. We have many programs targeted at our youth, including our signature Explorations in Ethnicity course, which equips participants with the framework, know-how, exposure to steer discussions on difficult issues such as race in a safe space. We also believe in the philosophy of by youth, for youth. So in our major annual youth conferences like Harmony Works conferences and the Model United Nations coming up quite soon, our youth take the lead in organizing it, setting the agenda and topics for discussion, and facilitating discussions with their fellow youth. Besides youth, we do a fair bit of work building community advocates. We do it through dialogues and conferences, learning journeys, and workshops. We do targeted engagements with educators, and most recently, in partnership with IPS, we brought conversations on workplace diversity into corporates. And our successful outreach is also due to the strong network of partners we have with the grassroots and communities. For example, the community development councils, the grassroots organizations, the ethnic self-help groups, corporates, HR partners, fellow like-minded inter-ethnic and interfaith community organizations, and even academic institutions like IPS. IPS has been a strong partner over the years, for which we are very grateful. And many of these I cited here are actually in the room here today. Next, creating safe space to discover blind spots and unconscious biases, building mutual understanding through respectful conversations. Now, in a 2021 CNA IPS survey on race relations in Singapore, more than half of respondents felt that racism was an important problem in Singapore, with minorities reporting an increasing perception of workplace discrimination. Most respondents also said that they were unsure what to do if a colleague told them they felt they had been racially discriminated in the workplace. More than half, 58%, said that they were likely to justify the experience as a result of other factors other than race. So basically sweep it aside and say, oh, it's probably not because of race, it's something else. Now, rather than avoiding conversations on race, religion, and nationality altogether for fear of discomfort, mature societies must have safe spaces for people to have respectful conversations on such issues. Each of us have our own unconscious biases and blind spots. Such conversations help us to raise our awareness and understanding of other races and find our blind spots. And in having such conversations, it's important that we adopt a spirit of mutual understanding. Don't always assume the worst of someone and avoid being oversensitive in the first instance. Such conversations will become akin to opening a release valve. Without a valve, the ethnic tensions will slowly boil and build under the surface. All it takes is for a racially charged incident to ignite what can be potentially a very explosive combustion. So the Workplace Diversity Program that we partner IPS on is one such example of how you can create safe spaces in workplaces. We focus on using evidence, so we use IPS's research and data. We try to make it interactive and experiential as possible. So we use forum theater and role-playing, so participants can see for themselves their own unconscious biases and blind spots. And they get to practice their conflict resolution skills as well. The feedback from the participants showed that the program has actually met the outcomes to help them increase their own awareness of personal biases and also strengthen their resolve to do more at their workplace to reduce workplace discrimination. The next one is rather than, so this goes back to that last slide, if you can help me get to that last slide. The one with the picture of the Young Sikhs Association and the advocate. Now, rather than a me versus you adversarial approach, choose the path of compassion, understanding, and building consensus. Now, a famous person once said, there's a fine line between genius and insanity. I say it's a fine line between social justice and vengeance. Have we experienced instances where we read about a purported injustice on social media? For example, someone who was discriminated against because of their race or religion. Now, interesting thought experiment, when you read about such an incident, Was our first instinct social justice and social fairness, as the woke youth would say? Or in honesty, hand to heart, was there some element of anger or vengeance against the purported perpetrator? Sometimes such propensity to take revenge or make someone pay can lead to behavior like cancel culture. I must destroy this person's social standing at all costs. Instead of an adversarial approach, can we exercise compassion and understanding? Instead of thinking of the worst of someone and canceling them, do we think about whether they might have made an honest mistake, they are truly sorry about it, and offer them a second chance? In Singapore, when dealing with socially divisive issues like race and religion, we've always adopted the approach of bridging divides, consensus building. There was a good example of this, as you see in the picture in Singapore a few years back, the story of the Young Sikhs Association and the influencer. So some of you may be familiar. There was a social media influencer who in the social media post described two men wearing turbans as huge obstructions to her view at the Singapore Grand Prix. The post went viral, and amidst the online heated criticism, where many Singaporeans called out the influencer and asked for people to cancel her, the Young Sikhs Association, instead of going on this all-out campaign against her, they chose the route of compassion and building understanding. What did they do? They invited her for an informal tour of a Gurdwara so that she could learn more about their Sikh traditions. And as Sean Sarabjit, the president of the YSA, who you see on the extreme left in the picture, as he shared after the engagement, all of us walked away as better people. She demonstrated humility, kindness, curiosity, and sincerity, and that's more important to us. So on that hopeful quote, I end my sharing today. I hope it's provided you with some food for thought on the role that community organizations can play to help mitigate nonviolent ethnic tensions, and I look forward to an engaging panel discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. We will now begin our Q&A session. Similar to before, you may use the standing microphones to pose a question to the panel. Please identify yourself and state your affiliation before doing so. Alternatively, you can pose your questions online by scanning the QR code on your tables with your mobile devices. Dr. Matthew Matthews, Principal Research Fellow and Head of the Social Lab at IPS, will moderate this Q&A session. I would now like to invite our speakers and chairperson for this panel to be seated on stage. Dr. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Testing. First, my thanks to all the speakers. They provided us very important insight to different communities, of course, the different kinds of action to mitigate some of the problems that come with non-violent hostilities. And of course, thank you everybody here who is still paying attention. I know it's lunchtime, and so, or just post-lunch, so everybody's feeling a little drowsy. But I think there are a couple of, I hope we have a good number of questions, and we will really want to encourage you. We've got mics out there, so we hope that you can come up to the mic and state some of your questions. I do have questions as well online, but I hope that some people will be brave enough to stand up and speak, and that I guess we'll get a very spirited conversation here. But I think as people find the mics and get ready, maybe I just want to pose just a question each to our speaker so we can kind of start this off. Taufik, you spoke a lot about the political reform which has allowed Chinese identity to be more freely expressed in Indonesia. However, you also speak about the fears that come from the local community who is a little concerned that Chinese culture may erode some of what has the cultures of other people and perhaps the majority. I'm just wondering what grassroots initiatives, local policy or community leaders, politicians, what do they do to mitigate these tensions Is there some kind of pre-consultation that goes on? Do they kind of think before they build perhaps a particular kind of statue, whether there needs to be some kind of negotiation with others? What goes on in that process?
Thank you, Matthew. I think that's a very good question. On the religious front, activities are usually carried out after the consultation, particularly if it involved minority religious activities. So that's one thing. Even building a religious places, for example, will need consultations. And that's become an issue itself. So that's one thing. There are a series of mechanisms that could help to mitigate before things happen. The second thing is about the culture. Sometimes when the culture event was approved, it also have been consulted with the local. Now the problem with all of these things is there are always issue with predatory politics. Predatory politics are used usually by politicians who want to make a political gains or statements by inciting the ethnic or religious issues. And those are occasionally become the inciting factors. But of course, when these things appear, what the Indonesians usually do is do another consultative sessions. And as you can see, very rarely all of those events evolve into eruptive conflicts, open conflict. So that's my
That's nice. Thank you. So that consultation does help in some way mitigating. That's nice. Chintan, you spoke about the Multicultural Act in Australia, and perhaps how you presented it was that it's really much left to communities to promote multiculturalism. So pretty much it seems like the state stays at the back, doesn't get really involved in that. What do you say about the success of that method, about the communities themselves doing it? Do you think it's effective? Does it get the kind of reach that it needs to? Is it very dependent on local communities being interested in doing it? So that, I mean, unlike perhaps where the state might be more interested in a more even kind of administration of a promotion of a particular kind of act.
Thanks, Matthew. I was prepared for a hot session, so I took my jacket out. Thanks for that question. Every country will evolve its own sense of its identity, and Singapore, it's different. You inherit a lot of the issues. Australia was different. Australia, if you think it's trouble to have diversity, we invited the whole world into Australia. That's a difference. We opened the doors and said we will, through immigration policy, be non-discriminatory. We'll treat everyone equal in opportunity. So we did that, and I don't know, in fact, perhaps Australia wasn't mindful of the fact that the new immigrant intake would come from largely Asia, because they did that from the 90s onwards, 70s, in fact, coming through. So we opened our doors to the whole concept that diversity was a good thing, that we can't discriminate against diversity, identity of people because of their background, and we welcome that process. Now, having done that, then we work through the process of saying, what do we need to do? It's largely grassroots based. And someone said, in some countries, perhaps even in Singapore, it's more prescriptive that the state would say, we will want to have a role to play. In Australia, we kind of like saying, well, figure it out, mates. So it's a process of negotiation, of trying to work through. It's worked and served us well to a point, right? And I suspect our democratic principles of understanding how people have a right to a freedom to express themselves and understanding how to play by the rules helps. And I'll give you an example. It's interesting. The Chinese premier visited Australia recently, and there was a lot of protesting in, I think it was Canberra or South Australia, I can't remember now. And both sides, for and against. Some came and welcomed the Chinese premier. Some protesting for a range of issues, including what's happening in different parts of China. And there was a quote from a Chinese gentleman who was new to the country, who came to view the premier. And he said, when he was asked, what do you think about the protest? He said, yeah, it's all right, I can protest. This is Australia, it's open country, it's democratic. Now, anywhere else, he might have a different view. But he could say, that's okay, it is Australia. And for me, that's an important element of where we are to understand that within our cultural landscape, this is the way we've operated. And this is in some large measures, this is the only way we know how to handle it. But I'm not suggesting for a moment that we don't need to perhaps look at how we can look at some ways to which we can have some prescriptive model about conduct. And it's ironic, as I'm saying with Mr. Shanmugam, I'd be interesting, perhaps there could be a bit of things we can learn from each other. Perhaps for us is to learn a little bit about tightening, and Singapore perhaps a little bit about loosening in some areas where it can work for you. I'm not suggesting anything apart from saying perhaps a free speech isn't that bad if it can be contained within the limit of giving citizens a sense of belonging and of say. So these are the very fine product, and every nation will work through those exacting requirements. Right? We do ours, you do yours, and it works at Singapore. And I mean, look, I wasn't born in Malaysia. I wasn't born in Australia. So I was born in Malaysia, raised there. So I understand the perspective as well. So for me, it's very valuable to be in Australia, running multicultural and race discrimination, coming from my background. So I'm still Asian at heart, but Aussie in spirit, and that helps me to navigate that very difficult area.
Thank you. Christopher, I'm going to ask you, One People conducts many of these conversations on what would be seen as rather sensitive issues when it comes to race and religion. What would you say? Because if we follow from the normal, discourse, really we should just have a free-for-all kind of discussion on these areas. Why all the care to have these properly curated type of conversations? Do you see any value in that? From what you know in One People, is there a hope to do more which is kind of organic within the community rather than one which needs to be curated? Your thoughts?
Yeah. So thanks, Matthew, for that question. So I think it's important to facilitate change makers and advocates to start their own conversations. Why do I say that? If you saw on the slide about the IPS survey, actually many people know issues like racism is an issue in Singapore. Even 60 years after the race riots, like I said, so many different types of interventions, policies, legislation, but you still get the incidents here and there. And people know that you need to have conversations, right? But the challenge is many of them actually fear to go into that space because they're worried that they may say something wrong. They're worried that they may end up causing more trouble, causing more problem to the situation than what it already was. So I think that's where it's very important to give them those tools, and that's something we believe in strongly in One People. Whenever we facilitate these conversations and help to build up these advocates, we give them those tools. And actually what we tell them is it's very important to also just be yourself. Don't become overly fixated on the tools. Sometimes when you come from your own experiences, when you're able to share candidly about your own experiences, it opens up and creates that safe space for everyone to also share, but in a mutually respectful way. Because at the end of the day, when we have those conversations, we know we want to build better understanding. We're not having those conversations to draw lines, right? To say you are on this side, I'm on this side. But actually, these conversations are to build consensus. So I think when people come to the table knowing it's about consensus building, that's where I think they are less afraid to have these kinds of conversations. Now, the other point I wanted to make also, it's very important not just to wait for them to come to One People, because we often find the ones who step forward to us usually are the converted, those who believe in the mission. But actually, it's important for us to also go out to communities, to workplaces, to bring these conversations to the unconverted as well. And that's why there's the Workplace Diversity Program, because we do know there are a lot of internationality tensions at a number of workplaces in Singapore where you have a very robust, a good mix of Singaporean-born and the foreign-born. And we do know these tensions happen. And we do know that HR managers, your line managers struggle to have these conversations. And that's why we deliberately bring the conversations there to help them become comfortable talking about these issues, and also to give them some of these tools to mitigate some of these tensions in their workplaces as well.
Matthew, can I add to that, because it's interesting, that's a very interesting discussion. In the work that I do, and particularly with the community, we talk community languages, because we don't talking old-fashioned that they don't understand. So the things that we do and the kind of arena where it gives me an opportunity to talk to communities, and I say things just like this, and some communities don't like it, and I said, look, the way I see it is this: if you come from different countries, and if you came from Shanghai and you're Chinese, if you want to live exactly like you were Shanghainese, Chinese, when you're wrong place, this is Australia, right? It's a measure of that give and take. If you're a Muslim Pakistani and you say, I want to be exactly where I was in Pakistan, well, hang on, it's not, right? Because it's a different context, a different country. And what does that mean to give? And so a question of like, how does a Chinese behave to be an Aussie in this country? It's an important issue. Now, the problem we have is this: we don't have the answers. We talk in those languages. But perhaps what Singapore is trying to do is to try and galvanize and say, that is what we're talking about, Chin. Those 4 guidelines. You know, we hang around the broad democratic principles, and we hope people understand that, but we don't teach it. We think people understand that. Migrants who come to Australia don't get to learn about democracy. They learn from their friends. They learn from society. There's no formal education or understanding. And it's worked well in past generations. And it's not always going to be the case. So Singapore is trying to give some framework to that. Perhaps, you know, there could be things we can do together to try and understand what is it that they need to learn to be in that special context of a country that's different from where they came from, and what do they have to give and take. And we don't teach that very well.
Great point. Thank you. Thanks both, Chris and Chintan. I'm just looking around. Is there anybody who has got a question? Nobody likes to get the mics. All right. Okay.
I'm more hot up now.
Well, okay, let me just get to the poll everywhere, and since some of you have submitted the most highly voted question is actually an ageist question, but never mind, we'll discuss that. It's not. What is nowadays a lot of racism and discrimination are being perpetuated by older people. That means boomers. So I told you it was ageist, but whoever it is, you need to attend our special program to help you get rid of ageist biases. But how do we change their mindsets and prejudices? Now, I know, Chris, you mentioned that earlier about the older person spitting when a minority kid was moving. I'm sure that might be also the case in different parts, Indonesia, Australia, perhaps those who come from more, a time where multicultural education was not common. They might struggle a lot more about accepting diversity. Are there things that can be done to change people's mindsets? Maybe Taufik, can I give your thoughts here?
My answer will be yes, there are things that we could do. Older generations have experienced what happened in 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Those were the time when ethnic polarizations were at its top. And then when the Chinese were alienated, all of those is both sides. The Chinese who suffered the discrimination will need to be encouraged that now it is safe for them to share some of the views, and while the other side will also be needing some kind of understanding that things have changed, that that's not okay to continue to harbor that deep sense of resentment. So yes, there are things like that, and I think informal sessions that is less judgmental is very, very important.
Have you seen that happen? In terms of initiatives?
In Indonesia, the Religious Consultative Council actually have done that conversation, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Any other thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, just to add on. So I think if you look at the context of where we were at, like say in Singapore, when I was young, my childhood, and the kinds of stereotypes or the kinds of, I guess you could call it like very stereotypical racist terms that my grandparents would use, you realize that actually these days, no one uses it. So there's a certain, previously what they felt was okay, now people say, hey, look, it's not okay at all. So I think that has been a change over time. Actually, I still feel the most effective way, and that's what I asked the youth when they told me about that story, about how the boy was spat at. I actually asked them, what happens in your homes when you hear your grandmother, say you're at dinner, and you hear your grandmother use a certain racist term for the Indian community or the Malay community, if you're Chinese, for example. And I said, actually, if you heard it then, couldn't you actually step up to tell grandma or grandpa hey, actually if you think about the other person, when they hear this term, don't you think they will feel insulted? And I feel that has to be the most effective way to create that change on the ground. Some things you can't just do top down and say, oh, I force everyone not to use this term. You have to have those conversations taking place in our homes, our communities, our schools, and our workplaces. Certain things are not okay. Yeah.
Okay, well, Matthew, when it comes to prejudices, there's two aspects to that. Our external conduct, our internal attitudes and views. They're not, mutually exclusive, but where government comes in, it's always about external conduct. You talk about Race Discrimination Act in Australia, it's about public conduct. Because that's the only thing we can capture. We don't capture people's thought and bait, right? And so a person can be as racist as they want at home in the midst of their children, but they can't do it in a workforce and they know it. The question is this effective? Yes, in the conduct, right? I would say in Australia, the factory floor racism doesn't exist anymore, where before they will shout out and call people names. No one is that stupid anymore to do that. Now, have the views changed internally? That's a more difficult part. And how do you change people's sense of identity? A lot of that's interaction. Obviously, the conduct helps, because if they know they can't do it in the workforce, they take it home, and it may internalize some of that for them. But a lot of that is all about the personal interactions, the understanding. So Australia had a white policy until the 70s. There are still people living today who live under that sort of regime, who probably don't know what's changed, mate. Isn't this the way? No, this is the way I live, right? And it's very hard. Perhaps it's a generational thing, but it's also the interaction, understanding. But a lot of that is also where the law comes in, obviously, shaping and understanding conduct. But it's also about capacity for interaction and understanding shared common values. But it's not enough, as I said before, at the point when a Muslim cannot be a Jew and a Jew cannot be a Muslim. How do you live that life together? And it has to be philosophy, understanding this is the way we live with differences. Who teaches that? I don't know. But if we can get there, it'd be a paradise. Right.
Thanks. Anybody else? No, nobody standing on the mic. I think there's another question which is highly voted, which has got to do with the fine line between holding someone accountable versus vengeance. And there's a question about whether laws, we've got lots of laws, zero tolerance, we've crossed, and that might hinder racial harmony. I'm just first going to ask Chintan, since you were human rights, or rather race commissioner in Australia, and obviously there are a lot of cases and people are concerned about some kind of grievance, perhaps at the workplace or elsewhere. And how do you kind of deal with that? Vengeance versus holding people accountable?
It's a mixed bag. It's getting more difficult. We're quite susceptible to woke culture, obviously. So that means that people, can scream blue murder, and it's just like it's racist. But there is a community sense of understanding how to ameliorate and perhaps deal with those issues. Now, the point is when communities turn to racist attitudes, we're very circumspect, and there's a great deal of tolerance for that. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but in Australia, this free speech thing is very powerful, obviously. It's a democracy, and people are entitled to their views. It's when they cross the line that the law will act, but the rest is about community conduct, about friendship, about communities taking a stand and saying, mate, that's wrong. So a lot of the programs we did, for example, Racism Starts With Me, it's about that attitude, making people understand. And we have actually white Australians. We got Craig Foster, who was a soccer captain, white Australian, who go on the program and say, I'm white Australian. I never know what experience of racism is, with my privileged background, right? And it gets Australians thinking, that's probably true, mate. I don't see it either. And so a lot of that is to open the understanding that people will have. But a lot of work we do now is also about systemic, structural. And by that, I don't mean the government set up those systems. It's a lot of leftovers, unthinking, unreflective, where they choose someone and say, oh, sorry, but this guy's English is not very good. And we have a boardroom problem with Asians getting into boardrooms, not because they're not skilled.
is that they just don't fit in. You know, they don't have leadership role. They're so quiet, right? And I said, "Well, you mean you're quiet? You cannot be a leader?" Right? So it's a focus. The change of attitude is saying, "Hey, that's a good leader, but very quiet leader." And that's an Asian way of doing things, and it's equally something we want and prize and take into our boardroom. Right now, it isn't there. And this is about changing attitudes. And the good thing about Australia is they're receptive. Doesn't mean they move fast, but they understand it.
Thanks. Any other comments, Chris or Taufik? Do you?
What I probably can relate to the religious conservatism. I think one way to address this is, again, we do not have a lot of in place institutionalized in terms of ethnic harmony and racial harmony. We don't have an established institution like you, state-sponsored. But whenever we have religious conservatism out in display in public, there are always elements within the Muslim communities, including those that coming from the two largest Muslim organizations, the Nadatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, who are readily come to say, look, that is not okay. And that is very important. The feedback and comment coming from within the community is very important. And I think that's one way to solve some of those very tricky issues.
Thank you. Moving on, I think the next voted question has got to do with the online space and what we can do in the online space. Are there things about maintaining harmony online which we can mainstream? Are there out-of-bound markers? Can we enforce some of these new online norms? I don't know whether in different societies. Just Singapore, we talk quite a bit of that. In Australia, in Indonesia, are there things that are currently being done in terms of helping people to recognize that the internet and there needs to be some kind of civility there?
I have involved in a few discussion sessions where we look at the contents of the online contents, again related to the religious segments. And there is a perception that certain things can be said rather freely if you frame it within the religious narrative. And the problem with this is, even though the initial recording was actually intended for the internal consumptions, we call it very often in Indonesia, it's for internal reference. Being online, that means the content can be easily spread out and consumed by other people outside your own groups. And that, in many cases, have created social tensions and easiness, because some of those attitude has become perceived as the general attitude towards certain issues, while it is not true, right? Because everybody, in every groups, there are always a diverse views on things. And this is the problem with the online content, Matthew, and I think the government have tried to clamp down try to clamp down and manage the online content that is hateful and untruth, but of course, there are only, you can do something, but you're not always to cover everything. So that is the problem.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think to add on, I think one of the concerns with the online space that I always worry about is the speed at which content is put up and goes viral and quickly causes division in society. And the first is that I think for Singapore, the premise is if it's a fake news, disinformation put out to cause division in society, it must be very quickly put to a stop. Because, if it's really disinformation content just put out there to cause division, we shouldn't allow it to happen. But the second is, it could be a real incident, right? Something really happened, someone said something wrong or did something that offended someone of another race. And I think the concern about that is, how do you then make sure that the debate is not just online? People just divide, I'm on this side and I'm on that side online. And the worry is sometimes that division becomes so stark, both sides cannot come together. So that's where I make a case that it's important to also bring what's online to the physical space to create understanding, to bridge differences, to find that consensus, that common space. And that was what the Young Sikhs Association did, right? That the influencer posting the thing was online. Yes, people criticized her, she knew she was in the wrong, but what they did to bridge the understanding, they did it in the physical space. They invited the influencer to the Gurdwara, showed her, and built that understanding. So I make the case that I think sometimes there is a need to bring what's online into the physical space to build understanding as well.
Matthew, in Australia, I'm not sure you have it here, I haven't looked into this. We have e-safety commissioner, whose job is just to look into that area. The e-safety legislation increasingly the monitors capacity to have messages online that are deemed to be undesirable. Now, I should be very careful with the undesirable. So that's what the limit is. What may be deemed undesirable in the country may not be deemed desirable in Australia. Australia is only about when any comments or input in the social media is such a level that it creates safety issues. And it covers a broad spectrum, not just about race, children, about protection of children, LGBTI, gender, and all of that. And so and Julie Imnan, the commissioner, is doing a great job there in that area, monitoring it. And government is giving more power, investing in it. So it takes up issues to Meta or X or Twitter, and it has got a power to ask them to take down, right, and shut them down. Well, to a degree, of course, to challenge in the courts, and sometimes to win, as did with Elon Musk recently. But there is mechanism in place about monitoring these issues, and increasingly it becomes more valuable because of the far-right extremism issues. And what's available is communities will then take it up with the commissioner and say, that should be taken off. We need to monitor it, we need control. So we don't monitor social chats, right? We don't believe in doing that as a country. But where it crosses the line, it becomes an endangerment to safety of people in any form, and then it's taken on as an issue. So that's something worth looking into and said, how is it working? It's relatively new. It'll be assessed in the next few years and see if it's working well. But we work very well with them in the race portfolio and said, look, there are some issues that we want you to take care of that are terribly important to give you attention to.
Yeah, and just to add also for the, in terms of the interventions, you see what happens online is very often you can have trolls, people intend to use the online space to cause division. So what then needs to happen is the example of the interracial confidence circles in Singapore, where if you know that the debate online has become so heated, communities are separating and dividing, you need community leaders to bring communities to the same table and to help them understand that we cannot be divided as a society. So that's why you see some of these mechanisms like the harmony circles, the interracial confidence circles, the grassroots organizations to bring people together on the ground with all these challenges that's happening online, with the online war that's happening. Yeah.
Make it very quickly an example. Doxing. It's a new term for me. I mean, the old generation like me don't know what doxing is. I thought it's some kind of dance, but it's not, obviously. But I'm going to know about doxing. And doxing became an issue only in Australia because of the Gaza issue, where some Jewish in WhatsApp having discussions about how to, in fact, promote some issues. And someone got the information and then put it online, and all the information flushed out. And there was 100-odd people who had Jewish background who had information splashed all over the social media. And people took it on to abuse them, went to the shops and did all sorts of things. And government woke up to this, oops, that's not right. So they've actually introduced anti-doxing laws, right, in Australia. And so this is a wake-up call in some sense. It's honed on some issues that they never thought about, right, in a time like this. So we're not averse to introducing laws to protect interest communities, but only very sparingly. And when we have to, when it's been so well alerted to us, because Jewish communities think we were attacked viciously with a close-up business sometimes because, we just can't, because they keep coming after us, And so this is an important element of where laws can be introduced when there's a need.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of interesting, the whole multicultural framework which communities kind of take care of, Australia, but increasingly in an online world, you need something more than just, I guess online communities can help, but to put some norms, so you really do need the state to act as well. We're running out of time. Just last, there were a couple of questions which really kind of looked at different places where we can do better intervention. One is, of course, tertiary students. One, of course, workplaces. How do you get the message out to deal with non-violent ethnic hostilities? What's the experience like in Indonesia when it comes to students, for instance?
Earlier we talked, I just briefly, because of limited time, I talked about how some conservative value was inculcated to the education system at a very young age, particularly the private educations. The religious departments is now headed by a very good man in terms of individual who actually have a very pluralist platform. The religious minister is actually from Nadatul Ulama. He has been trying to figure out what way that can be implemented to make sure that all of those education system that is associated with certain organization can be more or better managed or better monitored. And this is actually on progress, yes.
Do you any thoughts on Donald?
Well, in Australia, education system is inundated with a lot of informal. It's not part of curriculum. Our history is a different topic, but the organization, I mean, there's a group called Courage to Care, more Jewish-based, but it's largely anti-racism campaign, and they get funding, they go to schools, and they work with kids about understanding particular Holocaust issues and all of that. And right across, Muslim communities would actually engage communities. And we get engaged in human rights with government as well, and education ministry, and say, look, we need this to be filtered across to communities. And so it's also introducing functions, activities, and exposing kids to realization of living in diversity and differences and what racism is about. So it's full on, but it's not within government education program, but it is adjunct to what's happening.
Yeah, I think for youth, we do quite a bit of work with them in One People. And I think for youth, what I find very inspiring is that sense of, especially among the younger generation now, that social justice, I mean, a lot of people call them wokeness, but basically it's social justice. They feel passionately for that cause. But what I often share with them is it's very important to also look at the arc of history of where they are in that particular country at that point in time, that very often the way things are organized, the policies that are in place is because of the history that the country has been through. So whether you are a youth in the US, the UK, China, or Singapore, and it's very important for them to always remember the fundamentals. They can always look at external examples and pick up some of these best practices to try to apply to the Singapore context, but be very cognizant of why Singapore it is the way it is today. And in doing anything to change that, make sure that they are very clear about the values and the kind of society they want to build. So for example, I shared with you, in Singapore, we strongly believe that we do not want a me versus you adversarial approach when it comes to race relations. It's always about expanding the common space, bridging divides, building consensus. And if there are tools that can help to build that consensus, bridge divides, then why not?
Oh, that note, thank you very much. We have run out of time. Thank you, everybody, for your many questions, and certainly thank you for all panelists for providing very, very important insights. Would you give a round of applause and thank them?